So the next thing we're going to be looking at is setting a scene. So hopefully I can do this really quickly. But setting a scene, so what I'll do now is kind of switch over to the SketchUp file and kind of walk you through how I've sort of set that scene and how I kind of like used different elements of the 3D model. So this is my 3D file. It's really bare bones at the moment, but that's because I've hidden a lot of stuff just so it doesn't get too heavy and so I can actually show you things. So this is really cool because I've basically set up my own file. So this particular image is called the Garden of Eden. So it's that food court image that I showed you earlier. And basically I've, set up a really kind of like minimal I guess like file. So I've only really modeled all the stuff that is necessary and that's within the view itself. How I do this is, so this is like how you keep your file light, I suppose. How I do this is basically by having layers for each different kind of objects. So that includes if you're doing like objects of the same material, I would suggest you make that into a layer as well, and all your different elements. And how this is going to help is basically once you're working on a specific element, you can hide everything else and just work on that element, and then it won't kind of like slow down your file. So for example, if I wanted to work on the floor, I can just kind of keep that checked and then like turn off all these other ones, and that will make it a lot faster and easier and stuff. Another thing also is if you go up to Window, Preferences, and this is again if you're using SketchUp, go down to General. I check the autosave to save every 30 minutes. I believe by default this is every 5 minutes. So that can get really annoying, especially if you're like in the middle of modeling and it kind of like freezes to save the whole thing. And if your file is really, really heavy, like mine is, it will take a long time to save. So I suggest that you boost that up to 30%. Again, still keep your backups, still keep backing up your files, probably like every week. And if you're really close to the deadlines, then every like at the end of each day. And that's super important. And also, even though SketchUp does save backups, sometimes they're like really difficult to access. So just keep making your own backups anyway. And then another thing that I was doing is setting up different scenes. So as you can see, let me add a couple of more elements into this. So if I go into the Styles tab, you'll see that this current view is in the default design style. So where I can see like all the materials applied, I can see kind of like all the lines and that kind of stuff. And this is a decent kind of mode to be modeling in. I usually model in the parallel projection, but obviously once you're setting up a view for rendering, you want to do it in perspective. You can also do 2-point perspective, but you have to be really, really careful with how that looks because sometimes it can look quite off. But I would say once you are setting up different scenes, like I've got here or up here, I would say do them in the hidden line style. So that's this one right here. And that's because it kind of makes it a lot more easier and quicker to use because it doesn't apply any of the like materials or anything or colors, and it just makes it a lot faster. So I'll show you this scene, for example. So this is a minimal scene that I've set up, and this is just without all the really heavy elements. And I think I set this up just because I wanted to work on this specific thing at some point. And then this second one I think is the proper scene. So now you can see all the objects have been added in. So again, you just want to set this up so that it's in the hidden line style with no shadows on. And this is probably how I would go back and forth trying to like render and do test renders. So I would have this style, and then I'd also have an edit tab. So this is really important. This is how having an edit tab is really great because you don't have to hide each kind of object and go back to the design style. You can just click the edit tab and you're kind of like back in this sort of ground zero position where then you can hide or show whatever parts you want to work on. So I'd suggest obviously you have different elements to a render and you want to kind of work on each element at one time rather than trying to like keep everything on and then working on stuff like that because it can get really, really slow. So yeah, that's one of them. And then obviously I set up like multiple scenes. So I would say try and do this as early as you can once you've got kind of like your base elements. And what I mean by that is every image is going to have kind of like a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And so you kind of want to have like a base set up, even if you don't have all the specific details yet, just so you can test out those compositions and views. I will be explaining how I've kind of like gone about modeling all this stuff. So yeah, what I've done in terms of like modeling is kind of like use different components. So for example, this kind of like wall element, because I didn't really need to change much, it's not really a component, it's more just kind of like a group that's been copied and duplicated across. So that's another thing that's, I think, saves a lot of time, is having kind of like a base object and then just duplicating it and then just kind of like setting it out, tweaking it, rotating it, and so on. But for example, this kind of like lighting installation, this is made from, again, shopping related objects. So this is kind of like a street lamp base, and then these are actually bins. So this is one bin turned upside down and this is another bin, but these are actually all components. So if I kind of go in and click on them, you'll see that it highlights the other ones. So having components is really important. Yeah, I would kind of like have a different file for each modeling aspect or each kind of like revision. So another thing that I would do is, create these different elements in their own files and then drop them into the render one, just because it makes it quite easy to experiment with in another file, and then you can kind of like bring it in once you're, completely sure that it's, the way you want it. So what I mean by that is, if I go to, let's turn everything off. So initially this was kind of like just a regular floor material, but I wanted to kind of like push that even further and, make it a lot more interesting, use kind of like those shopping objects. So what I did was go to the 3D warehouse, search up, actually, let's do that. So yeah, what I would just do is search for shopping basket. And you can do this with like mainly like any kind of objects, even if it's not kind of like what you're looking for. You can always go in and tweak stuff. Try and look for like the simple ones. So like for example, that one looks really, really complicated. So does this wire one, just because it looks like it has a lot of geometry. So the one I went for is this one, I believe. So what I did in a separate file is downloaded this. I got rid of all the materials I didn't really need, simplified it, and kind of like applied my own materials, adjusted the like size that I wanted it to be. So that again saves you so much time, because rather than me modeling a whole like shopping basket out of nowhere, it would have taken me so long. And then in that separate file, I kind of like arranged them. So this is a white one, this is a black one, arranged them in this checkered style, and then just kind of like selected all of it as a group. So I think one line of this is a group or a component, and then each white one and each black one is also a component, and then just duplicated it to make a floor. Again, I didn't model a floor as big as how big the building is, just enough so I can see whatever's in view, and then tweaked it that way. So like you were asking earlier, Shanice, with the columns, what I did was I downloaded one of a like shopping trolley, I believe, and then I looked at how it was grouped and what kinds of elements I could like delete or make it a lot more simpler. Then I started kind of like rotating stuff, turning stuff around, duplicating stuff, and just making it into like a hexagonal shape, things like that, and just kind of like experimenting with it that way. So although it didn't start off as my own, it became my own object, and then I made that into a component of itself, added some materials, and kind of like used it that way. So essentially there's like a fair amount of planning you can also do in your renders. So what I would do like during the beginning, is basically have like key elements within your render, and then I'd like either model it and print it out and sketch over it, or I would like sketch to begin with and then list out all the different elements that I'm like want to be using throughout that render. Okay, so this is like the first few iterations of this food court render. As you can see, this first one is like super grainy, It's kind of just got like bare bones, doesn't have any materials applied yet. And this is mainly just to understand like what I need to be modeling. So for example, here you can see there's a gap. Ideally, you don't want any gaps, but obviously you don't want to model anything outside of your view because then it's kind of unnecessary. And then the second iteration of it is a lot more cleaner. I've added, a lot more elements within it. There's kind of like a lot of detail. But if you look really closely, they're all kind of like duplicated elements. So these are like food court booths. They're all the same booth, and one booth is a component that I've kind of like repeated across. And I think like going from this first one to this second one, I've kind of like adjusted the field of view and then also like the output settings for the render itself and just made it a lot more cleaner. I think this is where I started kind of adding more materials. So you can see here, like added this sort of metallic material, some flooring, some lights, and then another kind of like level, I suppose. So going from like this to this takes a lot of time, a lot of kind of like trial and error and stuff. So you have to really bear that in mind. And then here's where I kind of, again, started to apply more materials. I believe also this is the point where I added the HDRI, so the lighting is a lot more cleaner as well. And then here you can see, adding sort of internal lights. It really lets the materials of the object shine through as well. So these are kind of like the different references I was looking at. So I think it's also really good to have, all sorts of references while you're doing this, just because there's something that you can kind of like go back and refer to in terms of like the level of detail, the color palette, and kind of like how the materials work and that kind of thing. So just quickly recapping on what I was talking about. So, once you've got like that basic composition, ideally you don't want to be moving too far away from that. You can obviously tweak things within that composition, just don't try and, change stuff. And I think it's also really, really crucial because I reckon you could spend a long time working on renders, but it's probably really best to make decisions as quick as you can, just because you might be on a tight deadline, and rather than kind of like stopping yourself from moving forward, you want to like really quickly make that decision to have a specific view or have like specific elements within that render. And again, like I said before, with like your project narrative, doing a lot of research is really important too. So like I said, with these like references, these are only a couple of references, but what I was doing is kind of like saving different things I found. It doesn't have to be architectural stuff. It can be from like media, like films. It could be, paintings, whatever kind of like inspires you for that render. Do save it and kind of like keep referring back to it, because you never know what kind of thing could inspire you. Happy accidents as a result of experimentation, that's also a good thing. So while I'm doing all this like 3D warehouse stuff, obviously most of it is quite like experimentative. You're kind of like creating stuff, but if your project doesn't really have that narrative, maybe you're looking to do something really realistic, you could even like look at the V-Ray Chaos library. They have like different 3D models. They have like plants, they have like, different objects and stuff. So just think about how you can make it easier on yourself. Obviously, there's kind of like a different thing between, what's kind of like your building and what's kind of like in the surrounding context. So you don't want to be importing like other people's buildings as your own project. It's more just so for like plants and objects and background stuff. And then, yeah, like I said before, what the level of detail you want to be going in terms of like the things you're modeling versus the things that you're adding in post-production. So that will kind of depend on yourself.